to them.
Bob Simon didn't wait for the phone to ring.
But when you said a moment ago, when we started talking to people who knew about aluminum tubes, what people? Who were you talking to?
We were talking to people, to scientists and to researchers and to people who had been investigating Iraq from the start.
Would these people have been available to any reporter who called, or were they exclusive sources for 60 Minutes?
No, I think that many of them would have been available to any reporter who called.
And you just picked up the phone?
Just picked up the phone.
Talked to them?
Talked to them and then went down with the cameras.
Few journalists followed suit, and throughout the fall of 2002, high officials were repeating apocalyptic warnings with virtually no demand from the establishment press for evidence.
Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Could members of the press have known at that point that the administration was exaggerating?
Individuals did it. There were specialists who were raising questions. And one of our reporters, Joby Warwick, wrote a very tough piece about not just the disagreement, but how doubtful it was that these tubes were for nuclear weapons. It was a one-day piece in our paper, and it wasn't picked up.
But Warwick's story appeared on page 18, not page 1.
The front page of the Washington Post, or any newspaper, is a billboard of what the editors are telling you. These are the most important stories of the day. And stories that don't run on the front page, the reader sort of gets that, well, these are of secondary importance.
Howard Kurtz is the Washington Post media critic.
I went back and did the math. From August 2002 until the war was launched in March of 2003, there were about 140 front-page pieces in the Washington Post making the administration's case for war. It was the president said yesterday, the vice president said yesterday, the Pentagon said yesterday. Well, that's part of our job. Those people want to speak. We have to provide them a platform. I don't have anything wrong with that. But there was only a handful of stories that ran on the front page, some more that ran inside the pages of the paper, that made the opposite case, or if not making the opposite case, raised questions. Was this really true? What was the level of proof? Did the CIA really know? What were those aluminum tubes? Those stories, and some reporters worked hard on them, had a harder time getting on the front page. Why? Because they weren't definitive.
But who defines definitive? Reporter Walter Pincus's sources, deep inside the government, questioned how the intelligence was being used. But his stories were mostly relegated to the back pages. Across the media world, the bellicose but unconfirmed claims made the big headlines. The cautionary stories did not.
And I believe, honestly, people don't have a fear of irritating the White House, certainly not at the Washington Post. But they do worry about sort of getting out ahead of something.
Isn't that supposed to be scoop journalism?
Well, but you could be wrong.
And it's a truism that individual journalists and, in fact, the top-ranked media outlets they work for really want to be ahead of the curve but not out on a limb. And if you took seriously the warning flags that were profuse before the invasion of Iraq, that the administration's story was a bunch of nonsense about WMDs, you would not just be ahead of the curve a little, you would have been way out on a limb.
I don't think there was enough skepticism because I think most of us kind of believed that Saddam Hussein was building biological, chemical, and perhaps even nuclear weapons.
Isn't it the role of the Fourth Estate, though, to be critical of groupthink?
It definitely is, and I think we in the press were not critical enough. We didn't question our sources enough.
We weren't smart enough. We weren't alert enough. We didn't dig enough. And we shouldn't have been fooled in this way.
Even Oprah got in on the act, featuring in October 2002, New York Times reporter Judith Miller.
The U.S. intelligence community believes that Saddam Hussein has deadly stocks of anthrax, of botulinum toxin, which is one of the most virulent poisons known to man.
Liberal hawk Kenneth Pollock.
And what we know for a fact from a number of defectors who've come out of Iraq over the years is that Saddam Hussein is absolutely determined to acquire nuclear weapons and is building them as fast as he can.
And the right-hand man to Ahmed Chalabi.
And so, do the Iraqi people want the American people to liberate them?
Absolutely. In 1991, you're lucky people.
I hope that doesn't offend you.
When one guest dared to express doubt, Oprah would have none of it.
I just don't know what to believe with the media.
Oh, we're not trying to show you propaganda. We're just showing you what is.
I understand that.
Okay, you have a right to your opinion.
That's right. That's right.
Contrary opinions weren't very popular in Washington either, as ambitious Democrats embraced the now conventional but unconfirmed wisdom.
In the wake of September 11th, who among us can say with any certainty to anybody that the weapons might not be used against our troops or against allies in the region?
It is clear, however, that if left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare and will keep trying to develop nuclear weapons.
When Democrats did go against the grain, they were denounced by the partisan press and largely ignored by the mainstream press.
And before we put this great nation on the track to war, I want to see more evidence, hard evidence, not more presidential rhetoric.
I have heard no persuasive evidence that Saddam is on the threshold of acquiring the nuclear weapons he has sought for more than 20 years. And the administration has offered no persuasive evidence that Saddam would transfer chemical or biological weapons of mass destruction to al-Qaeda.
Ted Kennedy gave a passionate speech in 2002 raising all sorts of questions about the war and what the aftermath would be.
War with Iraq before a genuine attempt at inspection and disarmament, or without genuine international support, could swell the ranks of al-Qaeda sympathizers and trigger an escalation in terrorist acts.
Washington Post gave that speech one sentence, 36 words. I calculated in 2002 the Washington Post probably published 1,000 articles and columns about Iraq, probably 1 million words, in excess of 1 million words. And when the most famous Democrat in the country raised questions about the war, the Washington Post set aside 36 words.
It had now become unfashionable to dissent from the official line, unfashionable and risky.
Anyone who hurts this country in a time like this, well, let's just say you will be spotlighted.
If you're a journalist or a politician and you're swimming upstream, so to speak, you're going to encounter a lot of piranha, and they are voracious. There's a notion that this is the person that we go after this week.
Fox News and talk radio and the conservative bloggers, I mean, they were banging those drums very loud, and everyone in the press could hear it. Not only was it just liberal bias, it was an anti-American bias, an unpatriotic bias, and that these journalists were really not part of America.
And every journalist knew it. They had and they have a very effective slime machine. And the way it works is you either report the news the way we want it reported, or we're going to hang a sign around your neck.
I will call those who publicly criticize their country in a time of military crisis, which this is, bad Americans.
There's a level of vitriol and vindictiveness that is very scary to listen to, and you think the millions of people listening to them, the media have become sort of like the whipping boy because they know that the press can provide information that runs counter to what the government is claiming, to what the Bush administration is claiming.
Now, Johnny.
On his new MSNBC talk show, Phil Donahue discovered just what could happen when you stepped out of line.
City tonight. Anti-war protesters taking on the government. Is there a place for them in this post-9/11 world, or are they just downright unpatriotic?
I just felt, what would be wrong with having one show a night, say, hold it, wait a minute, can we afford this? And do we have enough troops? And what about General Shinseki? And where are all, what is Guantanamo? And what's wrong with this? I felt people who didn't like my message would watch me because no one else was doing it. That's why I couldn't get over the unanimity of opinion on cable. The drum was beating. Everybody wanted to bomb somebody. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. So here I go. I mean, fool that I am. I rushed in.
Scott Ritter is here, and so is Ambassador Butler.
You had Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, who was saying that if we invade, it'll be a historic blunder.
Yes, but we didn't have Malone. He had to be there with someone else who supported the war. In other words, you couldn't have Scott Ritter alone. You could have Richard Pearl alone.
You could have the conservative.
You could have the supporters of the president alone. And they would say why this war is important. You couldn't have a dissenter alone. Our producers were instructed to feature 2 conservatives for every liberal.
You're kidding.
No, this is absolutely
Instructed
true.
from above?
Yes. I was counted as 2 liberals.
They're underselling you.
I had to have 2. There's just